That one started. Okay, there we go. On camera. So welcome out to session 13. And today is August the 16th. And it's the year 2022. So here we are. We've come this far since January, and we finally made it to Matthew 24. This is the chapter when people say they're going to talk about the end times. This is the chapter they automatically think of, either this or Revelation or 2 Thessalonians 2. This is the longest discussion that Jesus gave about his return. And to me, every time I turn to Matthew 24, it just amazes me, because all you have to do is turn another page or two and you're to the crucifixion. And as best we can tell, this is about 2 or 3 days at the most, but probably just a couple of days before his arrest and his death. And you think, if I'm facing that kind of suffering, and I'm Jesus, so I know exactly what I'm facing, and it's a couple of days from now, that's where my focus is going to be. But his focus was way out there to his return. And one reason for that is he rightfully saw his death and resurrection and ascension as part of a continuum that leads to his return. And so in his mind, he could face death, anticipate the resurrection, but already be looking forward to his return many centuries later. And that's only God could do that. And only someone like Christ could look beyond the cross. And I think another reason why he could is that only he could understand that what the cross was purchasing, not just my personal salvation, but the redemption of entire creation. And that's going to become a reality at his return. So, facing his death, he could see what it was going to guarantee way out there in the future. And so, while that would be overwhelming on our minds facing the next couple of days, he took the time to sit on the Mount of Olives, looking at the city of Jerusalem, looking at the temple. And his disciples came to him. They start pointing out all the beautiful buildings, and especially the temple buildings. You know, that temple building that he had just cleansed a few days before, chasing out the money changer, turning over their tables, grabbing a whip, chasing them out. That building, and they were trying to describe the beauty of it. And here were these fishermen, tax collector kind of guys sitting next to him. They were the temple. And to Jesus, he saw them as beautiful, not that building over there. Because he had already declared it desolate. Your house is left unto you desolate. The glory had departed. Ichabod had already been written over that temple. They had turned the house of prayer into a den of thieves. So yeah, it was a beautiful building. But did they really think Jesus would be impressed with the beauty of that building? No, his love was elsewhere already. His love was with those sitting next to him. And they didn't understand that. And so this transition was taking place from that Jewish temple building that God chose to dwell in when Solomon built it and dedicated it, to now he was with his disciples. And being with them means he chose to be with them instead of down there in that beautiful building. Now, he wasn't impressed with it at all. That building had broken his heart. And so he's up there on the Mount of Olives. He's looking at, you know, what was the first thing Jesus said after he spoke about deception? And goes on to talk about other things, but the very first thing he said before he started answering their questions was in verse 2. Not one stone is going to be left upon another. So what a reply, huh? Jesus, look at these beautiful buildings. Well, let me tell you something. Pretty soon, there's not going to be one stone left on top of the other. In other words, this is destined for destruction. And yet, to you, I have said, the gates of hell shall not prevail against you. This temple is going to be destroyed. So my goal tonight, with these handouts I gave you, and again, I love this 7, then 8, 7 plus 1 equals 8 equation that's all through the Bible. And I mentioned last session that anytime you see 7 in the Bible, and in prophecy, 7 is everywhere. Whenever you see 7 in the Bible, you need to connect it. In Hebrew, the word 7 comes from the same root word as oath and swear. So one reason why God uses 7 so often in prophecy, it's God saying, I made a bunch of promises back there, and I intend to keep those promises. And every time 7 comes up, just think in the back of your mind, this is God saying, I swore something, I made an oath back there, and I guarantee you the return of my son, those promises are going to be fulfilled. And so he's dealing with his return here. My goal by using 7 plus 8 on this one handout, you should have 2 handouts, by the way. Do you have 2 handouts? One's on deception, just for your own. I love doing these. I do this a lot in my Bible studies with words or ideas in the Bible that are carried all the way through. Just do a landscape paper and do about 3 or 4 columns, ever how many you want, and just start plugging in the verses. And so with this handout on deception, column from the Old Testament, a column from the words of Jesus, a column from Paul, a column from John. And it just helps you to see, one thing it helps you to see is the Bible is a unified book with a single author. For instance, the first verse in each column is a quote or is a reference to each other, isn't it? In other words, they're all quoting Moses. As I've said many times in these lessons, Moses is the foundational prophetic voice. Of course, God through Moses. All the later prophets, David in the Psalms, in Isaiah, all through Malachi, and then the New Testament writers, they keep reaching back to Moses and quoting him. And so Jesus is doing nothing else in Matthew 24:4 than quoting Moses, because he gave those words to Moses. So he's quoting himself. And then Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 is quoting Moses and Jesus. And then John in 1 John is quoting all 3 of them. But the reason I wanted to put these first in each column is to show that idea, this continuity of unity, of truth, of phrases, of terms, of ideas that are carried all the way through the Bible, and in prophecy, they often are reaching back to Moses. So this Matthew 24, even though we're dipping our toe in this large lake of water tonight, my goal in these 2 outlines is to mainly provide a framework of the structure of this chapter. We're so excited to get into Matthew 24. We start reading, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? We have all these kind of questions, everything. Let's take a step back and look at the framework of the whole chapter. But before Jesus starts laying out the framework, the outline of his thoughts, the first thing I want to deal with is this idea of deception. He mentions it 4 times in this single chapter. So it's like all the way through the chapter, he's saying, don't forget, there's going to be a lot of deception. Don't forget, be on guard. And I have at the end of that, bottom of that handout, an unfortunate truth, a bad combination. Number one, there are many deceivers. That would be from that third column, 2 Timothy 3:13. But number two, we are easily deceived. That second passage in the first column, Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? You know, the greatest deception we have is we don't think we're easily deceived. Well, we really don't. We think we're sharp. We think we're on the ball. We think we're aware. But when the Bible says your heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all things, what deceives you the most? Not from without, your own heart deceives you. And then you combine that with there's a lot of deceivers out in the world, and that's a bad combination. And so Jesus, before he answered their questions, which their questions are verse 3, you basically have three questions. When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? I like to remind people, these are legitimate questions. But Jesus answered these three questions, not based on their own ideas or their own suppositions. He based them on his truth. So he answers the question differently than how they thought their questions were going to lead to. And so need to keep that in mind. But before he answers their questions, he takes up this subject of deception. Take heed that no one deceives you. And then in verse 5, many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. Well, we'd like to think we're the few that won't be deceived, but the vast majority will be deceived. When that man of sin comes on the scene and he does all these wondrous things, the Bible says in Revelation 13, the whole world will wonder after him. They'll say, who can make war with him? So, this COVID thing we just came through was a pretty good dry run of how easily super intelligent, very aware, super religious Bible students, non-Bible people of all stripes bought into most of it quickly and easily, and were willing to change major things in their life. And so if something comes along, which will be dozens of times more major and threatening than COVID, of course the vast majority is going to be deceived by it. And anyone who is looking at it from a Bible standpoint and says, don't be deceived by this, well, your head will be on the chopping block. Literally. Your head will be chopped off, the Bible says, because you will be upsetting the apple cart. And the worst thing against those in power, when the majority is being deceived, the worst thing that can happen is someone trying to upset the apple cart. And you have to be eliminated. So that's just the way it's going to go. Okay, verse 5, many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And then the next time is 24:11. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. How many times can he say that? And then in verse 12, because iniquity or lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. You keep having many, 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 many. He doesn't use the word few in verse 13, but that's implied. The few will endure to the end and be saved, but the vast majority will be deceived. Then in 24:24, for false Christ and false prophets will arise, show great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect. That tells us that very small handful of people who are recognizing what is going on it almost deceives them. And it's not just the information they're taking in will deceive them, but the peer pressure. Peer pressure can be very powerful, especially if it's people you love and trust and care for. It can put a lot of pressure in it. So all these verses on deception on this one handout, just take home for your own reference. Let me see, what else do I want to say about this? I do want to read those verses in 2 Thessalonians in the third column, chapter 2, verse 9 and 10, that this Antichrist, empowered by Satan, it says, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. That word lying in that verse is the Greek word we get pseudo from, false. And I think it applies to all three. It will be true power and signs and wonders, but it will be for the purpose of falsehood, to lead people astray. It will be for the purpose of tricking people, of lying to them. So it's pseudo in the sense that, not that it won't be real, but that it will be for a false purpose, with all unrighteous deception among those who perish. And then the two verses regarding the Antichrist and Satan, the last column, Revelation 12:9, that dragon, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, he's going to be cast down to the earth in the middle of these 7 years. And when he's cast down, Revelation 12 says, woe unto those on the earth, because the devil has come down to you having great wrath. See, people don't often talk about, when they talk about especially this last half of the 7 years, talk about the wrath of God. There's a whole lot of wrath of Satan going on as well. In fact, the wrath of Satan lasts for a longer period of time. The wrath of God is right down there at the end, very concentrated period of time. It doesn't cover the whole 7 years. Many teach that it does. You look at the actual wrath of God that's in those last 7 bowls or vials, they're way down there in a very compressed period of time. He's allowing the wrath of Satan to work itself out quite a bit longer. And we will not escape the wrath of Satan. Now, people love to talk about we'll escape the wrath of God, meaning that we're going to be gone into heaven. But God's not going to allow us people to escape the wrath of Satan. He talks about saints having their heads cut off because of their faith. And then in chapter 13, in verse 14, the false prophet and the Antichrist, he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs. So those false signs and wonders, 2 Thessalonians 2, will be used to deceive all of those who dwell on the earth. So, as I often say here, deception is not really good deception unless it really deceives people. And it's a simple statement, but if you can see through it real easily, if you can pick up on it real quick, it's not good deception. But all of us have been to magic shows where you see a guy disappear a bowling ball and he's like 5 feet in front of you, and you're trying to look at his hands and everything around to see how he really does it, and he tricks you. And you think, where did that bowling ball go? There were bigger things than that. So deception, if it's really good, can really be tough to detect. So then my second point that I want to point out on this is that in 24 verses 4 through 14, so I call that the first half. I call it more than the first half. I think verses 4 through 14, Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. Many have come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, will deceive many. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled. All these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So that's a key statement. It's not yet. The end is not yet. He's letting us know. I call verse 4 through 14 a description of this age, between the two comings of Christ, the entire time. These things have been around for the last 2,000 years plus, but he's really talking about from the time I leave till the time I come back. Verse 4 through 14 will describe that entire time. But I put it in this first half of the 7 years because I think all of these things will increase. I say that because verse 8 says, all of these are the beginning of sorrows. And I put here that the word sorrows in the Greek language is the word for travail or birth pains. So, we all understand that, especially the women, but, we all have been through that enough to know that it builds and builds and builds and builds. And then there's this extreme travail right at the end. You know that the birth is near, but the travail is great too. So there's this great tribulation right before this great joy. And the great tribulation builds to its zenith, to its greatest point, just before the birth and the great joy and relief. And that's how Jesus describes the great tribulation. Builds and builds and builds and builds. And then the Lord comes, puts a stop to it. He likens it to the birth of a human baby quite a bit in the scriptures. So all of these are the beginning of sorrows. So they go all through this age and they start building and building. And then in the middle of the week is the midpoint. 24:15. This is a key verse in this entire chapter. So now we're on the third point of this simple timeline. Jesus built in a timeline in this chapter that you can easily follow. So 24:15, therefore, when, so I have it circled in my Bible, that word when, you see the abomination of desolation. We know the abomination of desolation is in the middle of the week. We know that from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. He shall make a covenant with them for 1 week, for 7 years. In the middle of the week, he shall cause it to cease. He shall break that covenant. So it's really simple language in Daniel 9:27. You don't have to guess. When does this abomination of desolation take place? In the middle of the week when he breaks that covenant. And he declares himself to be God. He goes into the temple and he sets himself up as greater than God, demands to be worshiped as God. Revelation 13 talks about that. We'll have an entire lesson. It's a whole list of items. What happens in the middle of the week? There's a whole bunch of events all happen at the same time. And that's a big turning point. So that's why we divide the 7 years into two halves. And we make the last half because of these, what I call timestamp words. The first timestamp word is when. In verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. That leads to the word then in verse 21. So this last half of this 7 years, for then there shall be great tribulation. When shall there be great tribulation? When you see the abomination of desolation. So I have, in my Bible, I do this quite a bit with pencil. I circle the word when, I circle in verse 15, I circle the word then in verse 21, and then I draw a pencil line connecting the two little circles. Just, it's an old man way of simplifying things when you're trying to study. And then, the when and the then lead to verse 29, another timestamp word, after. So I have that circle, and I have a line drawn from then of verse 21 down to after of verse 29. See how he's just leading us along in an orderly manner, time-wise, throughout this chapter? When you see this, then this is going to happen, a great tribulation. And then as that works itself out, immediately after that tribulation, verse 21, the tribulation of those days, sun will be darkened, we will not give us light, stars of heaven will be shaken powers will be shaken. Then the last timestamp words of these four, there's more in this chapter we'll deal with, but just these four are enough to give you the framework of the whole chapter. Verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man shall appear in heaven, the return of Christ. So these four little words, and down here I put it, I like putting things along a timeline. I like the visual part of it. I think it really helps. But another way of doing it is just with arrows. One leads to the next. And then the verses under them, there's the outline of Matthew 24. It really is kind of that simple. Now, there's a lot about this chapter that's not so simple. But Jesus was very orderly in his outline. He knew exactly, okay, next stop, next stop, next stop. And so you just kind of work your way through the chapter with these timestamps. Point number 4 in the handout is another way of looking at this chapter as an outline to get the framework of it. 2 key terms. One is the word then that we've already dealt with. In 24, it's used 3 times. We already looked at 24:21. Then there shall be great tribulation. But another thing that is triggered by the when, verse 15, is the then, verse 16. In other words, hey, when you see this, run for the hills. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Of course, a lot of this is written in the language of that day. You know, it's just a way of saying in our day, you better find somewhere to go. Get out of there. Find a place to hide. Find somebody to protect you. And that's where Revelation 12 comes in with God prepares a place for them in the wilderness to protect them. The earth protected them. The earth fed them. The flood came and swallowed up those who came to try to kill them. Now, it doesn't mean the lot won't be killed. They will. But God's going to preserve a certain amount because the goal of the Antichrist is to kill all of them. And God's going to say, I'll let you kill some of them, maybe most of them, but you're not going to kill all. Because of my oath, the number 7. I made a promise that they will be here, both the nation of Israel and the church. They will be here when I come back. I will make sure. It will look like the Antichrist has won the war, but God's going to preserve his people. So when you see the desolation, when you see the abomination, verse 15, find a place to hide in verse 16. Why? Because verse 21, the next then, there's going to be great tribulation. Such has not been since the beginning of the world to this time, nor shall ever be. Well, how about if you're a Jew living over in Israel and your parents and grandparents died in the Holocaust in the gas chambers, Nazi Germany. And you're reading this and think, it's going to be worse than that. Yes, it's going to be worse than that. I mean, if language means anything, he says it's going to be the worst. Jews and Christians for the last 2,000 years have both suffered horrible persecution and death, exile, and all those kind of things. But when Jesus said it's going to be worse that's ever been, because I like to explain to people, that doesn't mean to the individual. Because you heard about some of the ways those people were tortured and killed. You can't get worse than that. You can't get worse than the way some of them were tortured for days and days and days and days and slowly stripped of their fingernails and toenails and their skin and their tongue cut out and this and that and every other thing. Until about a month later they died. Excruciating pain for a month. You know, the Bible says the main way in the Great Tribulation is through beheading. Man, that sounds great compared to torture, doesn't it? Give me a beheading any day. So when he says such has never been, he's talking about the scale of it, worldwide, not not regional or not in just one little area. It's going to be all around the world. And then he says in verse 22 twice. Well, that's not what I'm wanting, is it? Verse 23, excuse me, getting myself confused. Another then. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. What I'm trying to do with these words then is to show what happens between verse 15, the word when, and verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear. So what I'm saying is that all of these time event stamp things in between is what takes place in between, from here to here. So verse 15 down to verse 29 is describing the last half of the week, the 7 years. And then the other term, descriptive term, is the word those days. Which days? So in 24:19, he says, but woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days. See, people make fun of this kind of language because they say, we're in the 21st century. You know what? It just seems like this is so first century language. Well, he's telling it first century language, but you get the idea behind it is that when things start falling apart, truly falling apart, you really don't, being pregnant is not going to be a fun thing to be. It's just going to add to your difficulties. If you have a little baby you're taking care of, it's not just you and your husband. How are we going to protect this little baby? So he's using that language to describe what's going to happen in the future. And then those days mentioned twice in verse 22, unless those days were shortened. We don't even know what that means. Some say that means 24-hour days are going to be shortened to less than 24 hours. Others say that this is said to be 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. That God may shorten that to a period slightly less than that. Not a lot less, but maybe slightly less, because he says the reason he shortens it is otherwise no flesh should be saved. It's like he's wiping everybody out. So you got to shorten this time a little bit. But for the elect's sake, because I promised they would continue to the end, and I'm going to get them to the end, those days will be short. And these uses of those days leads to the final use of it in verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. So these are just talking about the time between the when of 24:15 and the then of verse 30. Now, this is not maybe a majority view at point 5, but it is my view. 24 verses 29 through 31. Let's read them. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heavens will be shaken. Then, when? Immediately after the tribulation. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. We will gather together his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other. And so my point of this is that the only coming of Christ, verse 30, coming on the clouds, the only coming of Christ and the only gathering together of the elect in this whole chapter, the most complete chapter about the events leading up to his return and including his return. So it covers the whole time between his two comings. The only coming and the only gathering of his elect is said to be, verse 29, immediately after the tribulation. So many people hold to a pre-tribulation rapture. I don't fall out with people who believe that. I've allowed it to be taught here several times. But it's interesting that the most complete chapter by Jesus himself, the Son of God, about from now until I return, he does not mention a pre-tribulation rapture, not even hints at it. Just leaves it out. So what's that cause some to do? What we call hyper dispensationalists, is to then say they recognize that that's a problem, isn't it? Jesus' own words in his most complete discourse on that subject completely leaves it out. How can that be? So sometimes the position is taken, there is nothing in Matthew 24 for church saints. It's all for Israel. That's why he doesn't mention the pre-tribulation. That's only for the church. That's the position. It's not my position. But it kind of forces some to that view, that this is only for Israel. Nothing to the church happens until Acts 2, the day of Pentecost. Everything before that is to Israel. That's a too of an extreme position for me. Then I like, let's read the rest of point 5. This gathering together mentioned in verse 31 is very similar to language of 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Those who are alive shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. And 2 Thessalonians 2:1 are gathering together to him. In fact, the Greek word for gathered together in verse 31 of Matthew 24 is the same Greek word as are gathering together in 2 Thessalonians 2:1. So I take it to be the same thing. Point 6, I like this one. The cosmic signs of 24:29. So the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken. This is from Isaiah 13:10. You just read it on your own, but trust me, this is a quote from Isaiah 13:10. It's said here in verse 29 to be immediately. I like the word immediately because it is immediately. Because he's got to scrunch a whole bunch of stuff together. Immediately after the tribulation are the cosmic signs. But Peter, in the day of Pentecost in Acts 2:19 and 20, which is a direct quote from Joel 2:30 and 31, I'm just going to turn over and read that. I'd like you to do that with me if you would. Acts 2, beginning of the quote of Joel 2 is starting in verse 16 of Acts 2. This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. He begins to quote it. And in verse 17, the last days. But skipping down to verse 19, I will show wonders in heaven above, signs on the earth beneath, blood and fire, vapor of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness. So that's, again, Isaiah 13:10, the cosmic signs. Joel picks up on it. Jesus picks up on it. Now Peter's picking up on it. Same thing. The sun will be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, after the tribulation, but before the day of the Lord. That's really like an important point. Because many people make the day of the Lord the entire tribulation. But you put these two verses together, the cosmic signs happen after the tribulation, immediately, because they're squeezed into a real short period of time. But before the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord has to be after the tribulation. What are the conclusions can you make? And so the day of the Lord is his actual return. Because on that scale where we have the 7 days, that seventh day, which is 1,000 years long, is the day of the Lord. And it begins with his actual return. It does not cover this entire tribulation period. So it's one purpose I'm trying to get across in this lesson tonight, these handouts with these timestamp words, is that forces you into a place, doesn't it? can't really argue with these timestamp words and what they're connected to. So this whole chapter is like giving us a timestamps, timestamps, timestamps. And this is what happens after this one, then the next one. Point number 7, very important thing to avoid is in verse 45 through 51. And, trust me, hardly a week goes by I do not hear this violated. Just this week already, I've heard it violated tremendously. Verse 45, who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? What's the role of a servant in the house of God? And if you consider yourself a servant in the house of God, and especially to the pastor, it probably highlights the role of the pastor in this passage. Speaking to the apostles, is to give the people in the house food in due season, at the right time. Give them good food. Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Surely I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants. So it's hard to make this like lost and saved people, isn't it? He's beating his fellow servants in the household. And eat and drink with the drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him. That's the thief coming. He comes as a thief to those who are not ready, not to those who are ready. And at an hour he is not aware of. And will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Boy, every child of God, every church member, especially every pastor, should memorize this passage and live by it and run from it if he sees that building up in himself to do that toward another fellow servant. The Brother Edgar Sullivan, I've quoted him a lot through the years, a longtime missionary to Okinawa when I was in Redondo Beach. And he would travel the world, he would travel the country preaching, and he would see all this stuff. Just saw this mess everywhere. And he said, one time he said, the best thing that could help the Lord's work is for one man to pastor one church. That really stuck with me. It's not my business to straighten out another pastor in another church. We've got enough to take care of here. So anyway, it's an important thing to avoid. It's a dire warning that's being ignored by many. Then my bonus, 7 + 1 = 8, is all the way back to verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. A lot of people make that like that parentheses part, make that like a personal commentary by Matthew, or something added later. No, this is a command by Jesus. He's saying, go to Daniel. If you want more about what I'm talking about, you go study the book of Daniel. Isn't it interesting he chose Daniel? He could have chosen Isaiah, he could have chosen Jeremiah, Ezekiel. He could have chosen any of the prophets. There's something about the book of Daniel that gives us answers that no other prophet book gives us. So the command by Jesus, if you study Matthew 24, verse 15 ought to jump out at you. You ought to say, I think I'm just going to stop and go to Daniel for a while. Because that's the advice by Jesus. And when you go read it, understand it. And when you understand it, come back to Matthew 24, and the whole chapter is going to open up to you much better than if you didn't go to Daniel. Isn't it a good piece of advice? It does a couple of things for us. Number one, it tells us where more answers are about this abomination of desolation, because he just mentions it and goes on. Daniel talks a lot about it. Several places in several chapters, Daniel deals with the abomination of desolation. The other thing it helps us understand is Daniel is one of the most criticized books of the entire Bible. And many in the religious world say that because of what Daniel speaks about, all these coming world empires, and he names them by name, how does he know what the name of a coming empire would be? So they say Daniel was written later, looking back, and it really wasn't a single prophet writing all this information. One thing Jesus, referring to Daniel, tells us is that Jesus considered him a true prophet and considered what he wrote in his book to be worthwhile to go over there and read. It's not a fable, or Jesus wouldn't have highlighted him so strongly. I'm so proud of myself. I got done early. And so I think what I've dealt with tonight might just generate some good questions and discussion. So if you don't mind stopping this, Steve or Gary, and I'll stop this, because people will only be hearing my brilliant answers and they won't be hearing any of the questions.